Well, 4.6 was one heck of a dense patch, wasn't it? We kicked things off with Arlecchino's release, which came with a ton of Khaenri'ah lore, and then we got to go to the ancient nation of Remuria and see what actually happened there for ourselves, and then we went back to Sumeru for Cyno's quest, which came with a lovely little side dish of desert lore, and if that wasn't enough, we also got some well-deserved Natlan crumbs. And that's a lot of lore. But it's also pretty easy to see how all these things could get lost and forgotten, so my goal with this video is to highlight all of the lore that you might want to remember for later. Just be aware that this is a highlight reel, and it's not supposed to be a completely comprehensive look at every quest or lore drop that's in the patch. That's what dedicated analysis videos are for. And speaking of which, I'm going to link all of the videos related to topics that I'm going to be covering here today in the description box, which you can check out if you want to and when you want to. And if you don't see a video there covering a topic that you're actually interested in, then stay tuned, because I probably just haven't finished it yet. That's pretty typical for me. But I think I've set some reasonable expectations here, so timestamps, spoiler warnings, related video citations, and attributions can be found in the description box, while post video notes and corrections will be in a pinned comment. Now then, let's get started, shall we? Oh, I have made so many Arlecchino videos, and chances are I'm going to be making a few more because her backstory has so many implications for all things Khaenri'ah. So for a deeper analysis of her, I'm just going to recommend you check out one of these videos in the description box because I go into way more detail there. But to keep things simple for the purposes of recapping, I'm going to try to explain only the important bits that we learn from her weapon, character stories, animated short, and teaser within the context of her story quest, and focus a little bit less on their wider implications, or else we're going to be here for ages. Alright, so here's the deal. There was a ghost haunting the House of the Hearth, so Arlecchino moved her children to Poissant temporarily while she sorted things out. This ghost is actually a girl named Clairvy, who was Arlecchino's childhood friend. They grew up together in the House of the Hearth under the rule of the previous knave, Crucibina, who was a harbinger as well as Clairvy's biological mother. Crucibina was a real piece of work, though. She raised her orphans to be child soldiers under a very kind and motherly facade, but periodically she would hold an event where her children were forced to fight against each other for the title of King of the House. Many children died during these events, Clairvy among them, while others were severely injured. These unlucky injured ones were either sent on dangerous missions, which would usually result in their death, or sent to Dotori for experimentation, which also usually resulted in their death. It was during one of these sick games that Arlecchino and Clairvy were pit against each other, and Clairvy, no longer able to cope with her overbearing and abusive mother, allowed Arlecchino to take her life. 1 year later, Arlecchino challenged Crucibina to a duel directly and killed her, assuming her title of both Harbinger and Head of the House of the Hearth, although she would insist on being called Father because she was certainly not the mother that Crucibina was. And although this was an amazing accomplishment for someone without a vision, Arlecchino did have access to another source of power that was found within her blood, and she inherited this power from her Khaenri'ah ancestors that came from the Crimson Moon dynasty. See, according to the Crimson Moon's semblance, the first dynasty of Khaenri'ah was that of the Crimson Moon, and at some point during this dynasty's rule, Khaenri'an astrologers managed to catch a glimpse of what was beyond the false sky, and the truth they found was so shocking that it triggered something akin to a civil war. Khaenri'ans were then split into two factions, those who still followed the remains of the Crimson Moon dynasty, and those who pledged themselves to the newly founded Eclipse dynasty. Those who followed the Crimson Moon were ostracized and exiled, which is likely how Arlecchino eventually ended up into that, in a situation that seems to be pretty similar to that of Kaya, although he's from Eclipse and not Crimson Moon. Now, one fundamental difference between Kaya and Arlecchino's lineage is that Arlecchino's ancestors pledged themselves to the Crimson Moon, which is a real planetary body down there in Khaenri'ah, and this appears to have given them some kind of blessing. This is the Bale Moon blood fire that runs in Arlecchino's veins, and the source of all of her unique powers, like the ability to wield pyro without a vision. But this power comes with some side effects. One of these side effects is the creation of shadows of the people that she's killed, and that's actually what Clairvy is here. She's some kind of lingering semi-sentient memory or afterimage of the original person, pretty similar to the sin shades of Enkanomiya, if you ask me. Another side effect of Arlecchino's power is memory loss. Not her memories, but that of other people. By extracting the flames from her blood, Arlecchino can effectively create this potion that, when taken, can wipe anyone's memory completely, resulting in a form of metaphorical death and rebirth because your memories make you who you are, and if you lose them, you're not really you anymore. This is administered to anyone who wishes to leave the House of the Hearth. Consider it a form of merciful execution, and we actually get to see the effects of this during her quest, as several of the members are expelled from the house after attempting some kind of coup, for lack of a better term. Linny, Lynette, and Fremine were also given the option to leave as they had tried to defend these traitors, but ultimately they chose to stay. Linny, after all, had been chosen by Arlecchino to be the next king of the organization after she leaves. But interestingly, Linny wasn't chosen for his strength like she had been. I mean, she even calls him out on this, but unlike Crucibina, Arlecchino believes that conviction is far more important of a trait than strength, and Linny has conviction in spades. However, I still think it's very strange that Arlecchino, being under 30 years old, yes, I did the math, is training someone who's maybe 10 years her junior to be her successor because it feels way too early. And that makes me wonder if Arlecchino's lifespan has been artificially reduced by her Bale Moon Bloodfire abilities. Like, if you read her character stories, there are a few instances where it says that her flames will eventually consume her entirely, and this process reminds me a lot of how Signora had liquid fire flowing through her veins that would eventually consume her life force. And I also think that we can see how much the flames have consumed by looking at Arlecchino's blackened limbs. See, in her animated short, we get to see her as a child, and as a child, only the tips of her fingers are black. But when she's burying her deceased pet spider, the blackness spreads from the tips of her fingers outwards, then recedes once Clairvy tries to cheer her up. This marks the start of a pattern between Arlecchino's emotional state and the extent to which her bloodfire markings stretch. The way I see it, it's kind of like how wood gets charred by flames. Limited exposure just sort of chars the surface, which can be wiped off, and the rest of the wood can be salvaged, but prolonged exposure burns the inside of the log, and that's irreversible. So it's possible that the more she lets her emotions run wild, the faster her flames will consume her, which would explain why Nouvelette describes her emotional state as a still pond without any ripples. She must maintain a perfectly controlled emotional state at all times. There are a couple more interesting things worth mentioning that are in her quest, like this mysterious Project Stuzha. Now, I don't really have a whole lot to say about Project Stuzha, other than it might be a reference to the Tsaritsa trying to trigger Fimbulvetter. Now, Fimbulvetter is the first sign that Ragnarok is coming in Norse mythology, and Ragnarok is basically an apocalyptic war that ends the rule of the gods, which I assume, at this point, means that it'll be a war that brings down Celestia. Because, you know, that's who the Tsaritsa doesn't like. Now, Stuzha means extreme cold, which fits with the themes of Fimbulvetter, since Fimbulvetter describes a period of 3 winters which will then create famine and infighting. This kicks off the rest of the events leading up to Ragnarok, like the wolves swallowing the sun and the moon, the stars vanishing, and the arrival of Surtur, who finally kicks off the war. Now, I mentioned Surtur because we know that Childe is somehow involved with Project Stuzha, and Childe's master is Skirk, and Skirk's master is Surtologi, and Surtologi is what you call the fires of Surtur, and to me, this suggests that Surtologi is involved in Project Stuzha, knowingly or unknowingly, just because of his relation to Childe, and the Norse mythology stuff, obviously. I'll probably do more of a deep dive into the possibilities of this in its own video because I did speculate on something like this a few years ago, but in very different contexts, so I think it would be really cool to revisit this. For now, though, I think it's time we moved on to Cyno's story quest. Now then, through a series of clumsy blackmailing events, Cyno's master, Cyrus, gets called out to the Temple of Silence by its leader, Bamun. Well, technically it's Bamun's grandson, Sethos. They want Cyno to return something that they believe doesn't belong to him, a Ba fragment. Now, in Egyptian mythology, the Ba is what they called the soul, which was then made up of 8 parts. Ket, the physical body, Sa, the spiritual body, Ren, the name, Ka, the vital essence, Ib, the heart, Shuyet, the shadow, Sekhem, the power, and Ba, the personality. Yes, the Ba is both the entirety of the soul and one of the soul's parts. It's not confusing at all. But don't worry, because we're not going to go into the specifics of each of these parts. I just wanted to note that they exist, because they may or may not be relevant in the future. Because, Sethos identifies 2 of the Ba fragments as might and glory. Now, might could be Sekhem, since that's power, which means that glory could be name, since in a religious context, it usually refers to one's renown or notoriety. But I'm not really sure how one-to-one Hoyo's trying to go with this, or if they want to mix this concept with other religious philosophies like the 4 parts of the self that we saw in the Narzissenkreuz questline. Because those 2 concepts are pretty similar, but the number of parts varies, so I'm not really sure where they're going with that. Anyway, the Ba fragment Cyno possesses belongs to a god named Hermanubis, a Tignarian chosen by Deshret to be one of his 7 sages. We'll talk about the other 6 in a bit. After King Deshret completed the Golden Slumber and Apep ate his body, Hermanubis founded the Temple of Silence in order to safeguard Deshret's permitted knowledge. So normal stuff, books, scrolls, slates, and that kind of thing. But desert politics have always been a mess, and the elites of Tulatula claimed the Temple of Silence was a source of all corruption and they were forced to leave. In Tulatula's defense, this act was only prompted because some moron tried to rebuild Gurabad again and declared war on Tulatula, but even before then, things had been going pretty poorly because Deshret had unleashed forbidden knowledge into the world, which caused plagues of Elazar, withering zones, and bouts of madness. which Rukkhadevata had successfully managed to get under control by having Deshret's sages, I think, build 7 towers that she imbued with her power. But Hermanubis had already expended way too much of his power trying to do his part in holding back the forbidden knowledge, and he seems to have been corrupted by it. He was unable to protect his people in this state, so he split himself into his Ba fragments, which could then be used by his followers to channel his power and protect the Temple of Silence. A ceremony of resonating with these Ba fragments continued for many years until the temple finally had no need of their power, and the remaining 2 fragments remained unclaimed. Now fast forward about 1,000 years or so, and Bamun decides that he wants to continue this tradition, but that requires finding a suitable vessel, or 2. Luckily, both Sethos and Cyno were compatible, and each resonated with the Ba fragment. But this came at the cost of many of their memories. Sethos stayed in the Temple of Silence and was thus able to kind of reclaim what he'd lost, but Cyrus kinda kidnapped Cyno and brought him back to the academia, which meant that Cyno had a large gap in his childhood memories. But anyway, long story short, Cyno and Sethos duke it out in the Rite of Duels. Winner gets to keep the other's Ba fragment. Of course, Cyno wins, and he gets to absorb the Ba fragment that belonged to Sethos, and Sethos ends up not making out too bad. He takes over leadership of the Temple of Silence from his grandfather Bamun, who dies shortly after this, then reboots the working relationship between the Temple of Silence and the Academia, which is a big plus. I say reboots because apparently there was a good chunk of time in the past when the Academia and the Temple of Silence worked together. They actually collaborated on establishing the 6 cardinal sins, which the temple calls the revelatory monuments instead. Oh, and fun fact, the Temple of Silence handles the disposal of all sorts of forbidden things, including Conrian technology. But yeah, that's basically the whole quest. Pretty short and sweet, right? Oh, but I do want to point out, there is a little bit of a bonus scene that you can get with Kaveh and Alhaitham in the House of Dana, where Alhaitham proves once and for all that he is the best troll in Sumeru. And before we move on, one more thing. We actually get to see each of Deshret's sages, minus Apep, who just kind of went off and did her own thing, in this shot from the quest. Asenath in the Temple of Silence even names them, which is pretty handy because we were missing a few names despite a few of them being listed in the dialogue of the Desert Sages staff. So this is the Goat King Hereshaf, this is Crocodile King Sobek, this is Ibis King Thoth, and this is Hermanubis the Jackal, or Tignarian, I guess, and Bennu the Bird, and Shesapunk the Sphinx. Now, one really neat thing that they all have in common is that they are all related to Osiris, Ra, or both, with several of them actually being identified as the Ba of Ra or Osiris in Egyptian mythology. Now, everyone knows that Deshret's demon name was Amun, which is a reference to Amun or Amun-Ra, but ironically, he has more in common with Osiris, who was also a sky deity before he died. His coffin is even inscribed with the label Lord of the Dead, and while I could go on and on about all his death connections, I'm gonna save it for its own video because I will do a Deshret deep dive eventually. But anywho, that's basically all you need to remember from Cyno's quest. So I think we've had enough sand for right now. Let's go wash it all off and take a trip to Remuria. So this section is going to be a little bit more of a history lesson, so we won't talk a whole lot about what actually happened in the quest, so much as we're going to be talking about what the quest taught us about what happened in Remuria thousands of years ago, okay? And believe it or not, this all starts with Deshret. No, wait, I'm serious. I'm not trying to force this. Remus was actually from Sumeru originally, which is really funny because his name spelled backwards is Sumer. He was apparently a singer at one of the oases, whatever that's supposed to mean, and he occupied the land before Deshret conquered the desert. And yeah, you heard that right. Deshret came from God knows where and claimed the desert as his kingdom. And not wanting to serve Deshret, Remus went north where he stumbled upon the ruins of an ancient civilization, likely one that was around during the era of the Seelies, because within these ruins was a huge silver tree protected by an eroded Seelie called Sibylla, who had taken the form of a golden bee. And just in case anyone was wondering, a Sibyl was a type of prophetess or oracle in ancient Greece, and on the mythological side of things, the three-eye were golden bee goddesses who were also oracles and even had a method of divination named after them. It's worth noting that all Seelies that we've encountered so far, well, the ones that can talk at least, have all been associated with prophecy. I'm not really going anywhere with that statement for right now, I just kind of wanted to point it out. I feel like it's going to be relevant. Anyway, she told Remus that he was destined to build a thriving civilization that would later succumb to a great disaster that would force the people of Fontaine to return to the Primordial Sea, which should sound pretty familiar because that was the prophecy that we were dealing with during the Archon quest. But just in case you forgot, in the early days of Celestia's reign over Tevad, the Shade of Life created Egeria to replace Nouvelette as the heart of the Primordial Sea. Sometime after this, Egeria indulged her oceanid familiars who wanted to experience what it was like to be human, and found a way to use the primordial seawater to change them into a more human shape. Celestia punished her for this by not only sealing her away, but also by destroying all of the existing cities and settlements in Fontaine, forcing those who survived to live in these small colonies. But Remus was determined not to let the primordial seawater destroy Fontaine again, so he decided to unite the people of Fontaine under his rule. Sibylla agreed to help him, and the silver tree she was guarding then turned into an enormous ship. This is his Fortuna. Just for timeline context, this would have happened around the same time that Gurabad fell and Deshret died for the first time. Now, Remus did manage to conquer and unite much of Fontaine, and he did create quite the prosperous civilization in the process. But there were a lot of pockets of resistance, especially the ones led by Irenaeus, who was said to hear the voice of Egeria directly. Still, Remuria was doing pretty well, so with one part of his prophecy complete, he turned his attention to the more problematic part. The whole everything ends in disaster part. So Remus decided to get more information from Egeria, and along the way he fought and befriended the current leader of the Bishops, Scylla. Egeria told him that there was no way to avert the prophecy, then gave him some primordial seawater and wished him good luck. And this is where everything started to go very wrong. See, much like Deshret, Remus was unable to find a way to break free from fate, so he decided, just like Deshret did, to create his own version of fate. But instead of creating a golden slumber, he put together a grand symphony. They're basically the same thing, though. It's just a giant hive mind type thing, you know? And it's also pretty dang close to what Renee tried to do, which is pretty funny, because, you know, history keeps repeating itself. First Deshret, then Remus, then Renee. Are you sensing a pattern yet? Anyway, the basic idea was that he could split the minds of the people from their flesh prisons, then put them into a hive mind until the prophecy came to pass, just like Narzissenkreuz tried to do. And then he would take their minds and he would put them into new bodies made of immortal stone and primordial seawater. The general idea here was that over time, this hive mind symphony would become Fortuna, or rather, fate itself. And since this fate was made up by the people it was governing, it would give people total control over their own fate, kind of like some sort of cosmic democracy. Now, some people were chosen and granted these special golem bodies ahead of the prophecy, and that's where the trouble began. See, these people grew a little bit delusional and conceited and believed themselves to be superior over the regular humans, or to even be true humans, which made everyone else barbarians. And to make matters worse, the hive mind was built around Sibylla, like as a framework, so she effectively became its overmind. But you remember how I said that Sibylla was an eroded Seelie? Well, she was missing some pretty important parts of herself, like her will or her persona, which, as you might recall from the Narzissenkreuz questline, is a pretty big deal. Especially because Sibylla's role was to guide humans and create a harmonious future, which is kind of like making sure the wishes of the people were granted. But because she was missing parts of herself, she was unable to differentiate between like a good wish and a bad wish, and she began granting selfish and destructive desires of the minds within Phobos. Phobos was the name of the hive mind, by the way, like the whole collective. Now this, combined with the Golem-Remurian superiority complex, led to war with the remaining unconquered tribes of Fontaine, which caused widespread panic among the general populace of Remuria who weren't yet a part of the Golden Symphony or Golemified. It was at that moment that Remus knew he was doomed. So he split Cassiodor, one of his 4 most trusted aides, from Phobos so that he could perform damage control after everything was said and done. Then Remus conspired with Scylla to stage an invasion of Remuria so he would have an excuse to hit the self-destruct button of the Grand Symphony. And then afterwards, Scylla would use his primordial sea power to return Remurians to their little flesh prisons. And, you know, then things will just proceed as usual, prophecy, everyone melting into seawater, blah blah blah. But Boethius, another one of Remus's most trusted aides, had been absorbed into Phobos and was corrupted by the will of the hive mind, so he sabotaged Remus's plans and sealed Scylla. And without Scylla, there was no way to return the people to their regular bodies, so when Remus actually hit that big red self-destruct button, metaphorically speaking, the force of the self-destruction sank the entire nation until only the tiny island of Petrichor was left on the surface. Cassiodor survived and then founded the Marechaussee Hunter faction, and he hunted down any of the remaining ascended Remurians led by Boethius, also known as the Golden Troop. These would have been the ones in the golems, right? And when that was taken care of, he sealed everything away and went to bed. Just one problem, though. Phobos was still operational. And after a couple thousand years of not doing anything, it finally decided to attempt to restart the Grand Symphony using Boethius as a kind of avatar again. He lured the traveler underwater with Cassiodor, now in the form of a cat, where they freed Scylla, and with Scylla's help, they finally managed to shut Phobos down for good, freeing the people inside and allowing them to finally return to the ley lines. Because that's where dead people are supposed to go into that. So the people within Petrichor at the start of the quest had been possessed by the spirits of the people that were in Phobos, which is what all of that red fog around their head was. These ghosts didn't really realize that the world had changed, and it was kind of like they were still mentally stuck in the past, which is a pretty sad situation, but when I think about it, it's not that different from the situation with Clairvy, is it? Also, fun fact, Phobos is the name of one of Mars's moons, which is very fitting since Seelies are moon creatures. But it's also the name for the Greek god of fear that's brought about by war. And Phobos, this god, was also the son of Ares, the god of war, who was likened to Mars in Roman times. I just think think it's cool how things come about full circle. But alright, that's enough of that. Ito's event is actually very, very simple. It's just a fun little musical event surrounding some urban legend that Ito heard once about a dog that saved a bunch of stray animals during a war. Basically, the Yashiro Commission and Watatsumi collaborated to help civilians escape from active war zones using the names of animals as code names to conceal their actions. Now, Cat with Blue Hat made a really great video on this explaining the intricacies of the plan, so I'm gonna leave a link to that in the description if you want to know more about how all this went down, because it's actually really interesting. Oh, but also equally frustrating because, once again, Ayato's best characterization and big brain schemes happen off screen. But you should still go check it out. It's cool. Now, towards the end of the festival, Miko and A have a very short discussion about the war, specifically the resistance war that was brought about by the Vision Hunt decree. This war is a particular soft spot for A because it kind of was her fault, because it was a product of her grief and negligence, and therefore a huge source of regret for her. Like, A is a very compassionate person, and she really doesn't want people to suffer, so these lines from her are kind of like a declaration that she's going to do everything within her power to prevent a situation like the resistance war from happening ever again, because no one deserves to suffer. Which I think is huge. It's a great show of conviction from her. However, you can read into this a little bit and think of A as being aware of a potential situation in the future where war might break out again. Not due to her negligence or anything, but due to something more inevitable. And having witnessed the horrors of war and empathizing with the people of Inazuma, she's resolved to protect them no matter the cost. And if there is an inevitable war, it's likely going to be the one that the Tsaritsa and the Abyss Order are preparing for against Celestia. You know, that whole Project Stuzha and Ragnarok kind of thing. But other than that, I personally wouldn't read too much into this. But between now and some theoretical apocalyptic war, we're actually gearing up to head to the Nation of War, and as such, we've finally been getting some Natlan crumbs. And listen, I kind of just want to put all of the speculations I have about Natlan in its own video because there's a lot to collate from previous patches and the teasers and all that, so forgive me for being a bit brief here and just outlining what we learned from the Saurian Search quest. So similarly to Bathismal Bishops in Enkanomiya or the Geo-Bishops of Liyue, it seems as though the Natlan Saurians are capable of undergoing evolution and obtaining different elements in the process. We only get to see 3 of these, well, I think 4 technically since one is flying in the trailer, but even so, I would argue that these Saurians are far more evolved than the Bathismal or Geo-Bishops. Not only do they have more variation in their body types, but there's also a Dendro one, which, alongside Animo, is one of the only elements that's not found within the Bathismal or Geo-Bishops. They're also a lot smaller than these other Bishops, I think, which kind of reminds me of how humans and wolves formed this symbiotic relationship that over the years made the wolves get smaller and obtain floppier ears. This phenomenon has actually been observed in multiple species like foxes, which I think is pretty cool. Now, I'm not saying that Saurians are domesticated Bishops or anything, I'm just saying that they've co-evolved to live alongside humans unlike their Bathismal and Geo counterparts, which is likely the source of their current appearance. But that said, I strongly suspect that Natlan is going to throw us for a bit of a loop and perhaps show us what life could have been like had the dragons and humans tried to work together from the start, forming a symbiotic relationship with each other, rather than trying to compete for dominance and relying on war to settle things. Which is ironic in the Nation of War. There is one other thing. There's this one offhand comment by Paimon that really gave me pause. She suggested that slimes were fairly docile, at least compared to the other things that we've been fighting for this guy, and since both slimes and saurians are elemental creatures, then perhaps slimes have the potential to become saurians. Which again, seems like a throwaway line. In any other context, I'd just be like, yep, that's funny, Paimon's just being funny, I'll leave it at that. However, there's a book that's been in the game since forever called Breeze Amidst the Forest, and in Volume 1, it says, typically when life arises from the elements, it either descends and becomes a slime, or ascends and becomes a crystal fly. Rarely does this process give rise to dangerous elemental monsters. Elemental dragons are rarely seen and have powers to match the gods of old. And I don't know about you, because maybe it's just me, but like, these two lines when put together make me think that slimes could just be, you know, gooey, unhatched dragon eggs. Which is a little concerning because Paimon has a very weird relationship with slimes. Like, she likes eating them. A lot. To the point where in one of her teapot lines, the traveler asks her what she would want to buy from a store that could sell her anything her heart desired, and she was like, a slime creator. So like a machine to make slimes. For food? For friends? I don't know. Either way, I'm a little suspicious. Now, this quest also has this neat little story in here about Kunter, who was hated by the sun but eventually became a hero, but I kind of want to save that for the full Natlan video, so put a pin in that one. And with that said, that is going to be it from me for now. Thank you to all of my awesome channel members, the budding scholars I've been scrolling by for a while now, and I hope you all enjoyed this little lore highlights video, and if you didn't, well, somehow you made it to the end anyway, so congratulations! But regardless of whether you enjoyed or didn't, take care of yourselves, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye!